Ever wondered what the greatest empire in history was? We often mention the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, but there's one we always forget, especially the French, the British Empire, a superpower that dominated the world for over 3 centuries. But how did a small island nation become the largest empire in history? To understand this, we need to go back in time to a time when England was far from being a world power. I'm going to tell you all about a fascinating story, full of twists and turns, battles and conquests, which forged the world as we know it today. So subscribe to support the channel and turn on the notification bell to be alerted when we post something new. Enjoy the video. The year is 1453. After more than a century of conflict, the 100 Years' War ended with the defeat of the Kingdom of England. Losing almost all its possessions in France, England was practically driven out of continental Europe. The English found themselves isolated on the British Isles, at the very end of the Christian world. In other words, England was in a cul-de-sac, condemned to remain a secondary power forever, and everything could have ended there, but a Genoese navigator had to be reckoned with. At the end of the 15th century, Spain and Portugal, thanks to navigators such as Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, announced that they had succeeded in crossing the Atlantic and bypassing Africa to reach India. Hitherto on the periphery of the known world, England suddenly found itself at the center of the world, at the crossroads of the great maritime routes. The kingdom seized its opportunity and embarked on a long process of exploration, trade, and conquest across the globe. Between 1497 and 1603, several exploratory missions were launched. The English explorer Jean Cabot, working for the English crown, crossed the Atlantic to Newfoundland. The explorer Richard Chancellor sailed around Scandinavia to trade with Russia. Henry Hudson sailed along Greenland to Labrador, while Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe in 1577, exploring the American coast along the Pacific. But it wasn't until 1607, under King James I, that Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in America, was founded by the Virginia Company, a shipping company whose aim was to establish colonies in America on behalf of the English crown. Other colonies soon followed, marking the beginning of the British Empire. Since the Protestant Reformation, which saw England break away from the Roman Catholic Church to found the Anglican Church, the United Kingdom has been divided. Among the Protestant dissidents fleeing England, some embarked on the famous Mayflower ship in 1620 and set out to found Massachusetts, where their ideas of religious freedom and autonomy from the crown were to become the fundamental values of the future American nation. English Catholics also founded colonies, such as Maryland in 1637. Over the following century, a total of 13 colonies sprang up, including New York, New Jersey, and North and South Carolina, which would count up to 1 million English inhabitants in the following century. But the English didn't confine themselves to North America. Like most European powers, they wanted to exploit the resources of the New World, such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. Between 1624 and 1655, they took control of several islands in the West Indies, including Street Kitts, Barbados, Antigua, and Bermuda, while Jamaica was taken from the Spanish. To exploit resources in America, the English actively participated in slavery. Slaves were bought in trading posts on the African coast and transported to the Americas under terrible conditions. But in the 17th century, the English crown was shaken by a revolution that led to the end of absolute monarchy and the creation of a constitutional monarchy. England merged with Scotland to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain. On the contrary, thanks to its colonial trade, the United Kingdom quickly became one of the most prosperous states in Europe. The British won the 7 Years' War against France, Spain, and their Amerindian allies, enabling them to expand even further into North America. Since 1713, they had already had Hudson Bay and Newfoundland, but now the British had Canada, guaranteeing them dominion over the whole of Northeast America. At the same time, on the other side of the globe, the British Empire also had its sights set on India. And what enabled the English and other Europeans to expand so far from Europe? Their shipping companies. Founded for the most part in the 17th century, they transported goods between the colonies and the metropolis. The most powerful of these companies is undoubtedly the East India Company, created in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth. Thanks to this company, the English have been present in India since 1611, when they founded their first trading post in Surat. Others soon followed, in Madras in 1642, Bombay in 1668, and Calcutta in 1690. But the English were no longer content to sit back and trade with the Indians. Despite stiff competition from the Portuguese, Dutch, and then French, the English took advantage of the collapse of the Mughal Empire, the Indian Empire that held a large part of India, to move into action. Great Britain allied itself with the Bengal Sultanate, defeating the French and attacking various independent Indian rajas to integrate them into its sphere of influence until 1815, when the entire eastern coast of India came under the domination of the East India Company. It was during this period that explorer James Cook discovered Hawaii and New Caledonia, and toured New Zealand and Antarctica. He was also the first European to land in Australia, which for many years served as an open-air prison. Prisons were overcrowded at the time, so the British decided to send their prisoners to Australia, as far away from Europe as possible. In the space of a century, the British have succeeded in extending their influence to the four corners of the globe. On the seas, more and more ships flew the Union Jack, and the country grew richer and richer thanks to its colonies and the resources they sold to other Europeans. But this colonial empire was divided, and even began to fracture where it all began, in America. Since the 1680s, the inhabitants of New England have suffered numerous wars against other Europeans and Native Americans. Isolated from the old continent and abandoned by the British Empire, they had to fend for themselves and organize their own defense, which led the colonists to gradually emancipate themselves and become independent from the crown. So when His Majesty George III decided to impose new taxes to pay for his wars, it was the last straw for the North American colonists, who demanded to be represented in Parliament to have their say on such decisions. Among these new taxes was a tea tax, which broke the teapot on December 16, 1773 in Boston, when a group of colonists broke into East India Company merchant ships and destroyed their cargo of tea by throwing it overboard. This marked the beginning of a series of events that led to the Declaration of Independence of the United States on July 4, 1776. After several confrontations and the arrival of the French to support the American insurgents, the Royal Navy was defeated by the American and French fleets in Chesapeake Bay, and the American patriots crushed the Redcoats at the Battle of Yorktown. The United States of America gained its independence in 1781. After losing one of its biggest possessions, the British Empire found itself in dire straits. At the same time, in the West Indies, the sugar islands were becoming less and less profitable and India more and more difficult to manage, so the British elite began to think that this might be the beginning of the end. Yet the empire managed to bounce back, thanks in large part to the French. This second wind is what some specialists often refer to as the Second British Empire. By the end of the 18th century, for many British people, the idea of an empire across the ocean seemed to be a thing of the past, but it took the French Revolution and Napoleon's empire to enable the empire to resume its expansion. The revolution gave the British the opportunity to reclaim many territories that France could no longer defend. In the Mediterranean, for example, they took Malta in 1800, in addition to Gibraltar, which they already held. In the West Indies, they took St. Lucia, Trinidad, Tobago, and part of French Guiana. In the Indian Ocean, they took Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. In Africa, they repelled the Dutch and French to settle in South Africa. After the Wars of the Revolution, the Empire, and the fall of Napoleon, sent into exile on the island of St. Helena off the coast of Africa after the debacle of Waterloo, the territory of the British Empire almost doubled. From 26 territories in 1792, the British Empire grew to 43 in 1815, territories scattered across the globe in which some 200 million people lived, a quarter of the world's population at the time. 1/4 of the people living on Earth in 1815 were either British or under their rule, and that was only the beginning. In 1837, an 18-year-old Queen, Victoria, ascended the throne. It was during her long reign of over 63 years that the British Empire flourished. In the 19th century, the East India Company continued its expansion in Asia. Between 1843 and 1875, It completed the colonization of India as far as Nepal and took possession of Burma. When the company was dissolved in 1858, India was fully integrated into the empire and became the pearl of the empire, from which the empire drew most of its resources. This was the birth of the so-called British Raj, an immense colony that covered much more than present-day India, including Bangladesh and Pakistan. In 1877, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India, giving the British Raj a special status. Further north, the immense Russian Empire was advancing into Central Asia, threatening Persia and northern India. To secure the Raj, the British launched 2 wars in 1838 and 1878 to seize Afghanistan, but to no avail. Russia also tried unsuccessfully to seize it, and the area served as a buffer between the 2 powers. In the Pacific, the British colonized several archipelagos that served as relay points across the ocean. In the Mediterranean, they colonized Cyprus, and in Africa, after South Africa, Somalia, Ghana, Sierra Leone, and of course Egypt, with the pharaonic construction of the Suez Canal, completed in 1869. In the Middle East, the empire took Yemen and Bahrain, and in Asia the British bought or took by force the strategic ports of Singapore and Hong Kong. Between 1839 and 1856, they were at war with the Chinese Empire, and the Opium War, which the British won, enabled them to force the Chinese to grant them major commercial and financial advantages. And the funny thing is that all these conquests took place at a time when Queen Victoria hadn't even defined a real colonial policy. Like an ogre, the British Empire is content to swallow any territory that comes its way. In Nigeria and New Zealand, for example, British citizens set up home and then seek the protection of their country, which eventually rallies round and takes possession of the area. This was the era of the Pax Britannica. Like the Roman Empire and the Pax Romana in its time, Great Britain was powerful enough to offer peace and stability to its inhabitants. Despite this, the desire for emancipation on the part of the inhabitants of the predominantly white and Christian colonies remained. That's what's happening in Canada, where a large proportion of the population is French-speaking and would like to break away from the crown. And since the British feared a new war of independence in America, this time they accepted the colonists' demands for autonomy. Canada became semi-independent, self-governing, and had its own federal system. This led to the creation of the so-called dominions, colonial territories authorized by the Crown to govern themselves, provided they maintained close commercial, diplomatic, and military ties with the former metropolis. That's why today, even though Canada has its own army, prime minister, government, etc., every Canadian remains a subject of King Charles III. After Canada, other territories quickly followed suit, including Newfoundland, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. But the British Crown was less generous with the other colonies, whose populations were less similar to typical English. Nevertheless, the black slave trade was abolished in 1807 and slavery banned throughout the empire in 1833. Clearly, they didn't do this out of the goodness of their hearts, just because slavery was no longer profitable, and the more revolts there were, the more unpopular it became. In short, Europeans found a better way by colonizing Africans directly in their own countries. At the end of the 19th century, Europeans began the scramble for Africa. In the space of 50 years, they took over almost the entire continent, 3 times their size. Unsurprisingly, Great Britain took the biggest chunks. By this time, Queen Victoria was not only reigning over the greatest power of her time, but her empire, though mainly colonial, was nothing less than the largest in history. The British were literally everywhere, in Europe, North and South America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. But as we shall see, this great British Empire may in fact have been a colossus with feet of clay. At the end of the 19th century, the British Empire was what we would today call a superpower, at the heart of an absolutely unique period in human history, when technical innovations flourished everywhere, and most of them came from where? Yes, from Great Britain. One invention in particular changed the face of the world. In 1804, English engineer Richard Trevithick developed the locomotive. This invention would enable Great Britain to accelerate its industrialization. Europe, led by the British Empire, became more industrialized, its economy more dynamic than ever, and its demographic growth enabled it to compete with Asia. In 1860, despite representing just 2% of the world's population, the British produced 50% of the world's coal and steel. A fifth of world trade was managed by British merchants, and a third of the world's ships sailed under British flags. But if, almost 4 centuries after John Cabot, the British Empire does indeed seem to have become the center of the world, it still has some serious weaknesses. Firstly, the empire's greatest strength, but also its greatest weakness, is its colonies, on which it is totally dependent. The colossal industry set up in the metropolis only functions thanks to imports of resources produced in the colonies across the globe. If they disappear, everything grinds to a halt. If war or revolution breaks out in the colonies, the whole empire could suddenly collapse. Secondly, finance. Although British finance was the most advanced in the world at the time, it rested on fragile foundations. Where other countries based their wealth mainly on agriculture, the British were at a higher level, being the precursors of the capitalist system. And thirdly, competition from other powers will intensify. In the first half of the 19th century, the British Empire became the world's leading power. The rest of Europe was slowly recovering from the Napoleonic Wars and industrializing. But by the 1860s, other Europeans and the fledgling United States had caught up and were challenging British hegemony. The French, Belgians, Germans, and Italians also wanted their own colonial empire. This led to fierce competition, especially in Africa during the colonial period. And finally, the other major difficulty for the British Empire was its army. Despite a still powerful navy, peace in Europe, and the emergence of liberal ideology and free trade theory, which rejected state intervention, all these factors led to a reduction in military spending. The result was that, by 1880, the British Army was 2x smaller than either the French or German armies. This is the reason why Great Britain will hardly ever intervene militarily against a great power, except during the Crimean War, alongside the French and Ottomans against the Russians. The army was mainly used to quell revolts in the colonies, such as the Sipais in 1857, or in minor conflicts such as against the Zulus and Boers in South Africa in the 1880s. The empire prefers to play on its diplomatic and commercial power to sway the slightest quarrel in its favor. And for this, it can count on what has undoubtedly enabled it to hold on to so many territories scattered across the globe: the Royal Navy. From the French Revolution to the end of the 19th century, no other power had as many ships and as many cannons as the British fleet. The Royal Navy protected the empire's trade across the globe and threatened all those who would jeopardize the crown's interests. And finally, the British Empire dominates thanks to its financial power, with the establishment of the London Stock Exchange, which becomes the heart of this new global economic system dominated by London. All this enabled the empire, despite its fragilities, to maintain its position as the world's leading commercial and industrial power until 1914. In the aftermath of the First World War, the empire reached its territorial apogee by recovering part of the German colonies and seizing the remnants of the defunct Ottoman Empire in Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. The empire on which the sun never sets, as it is nicknamed, now covers 1/5 of the world's landmass and is home to 1/4 of the world's population, spread over some 80 colonies. The various technical advances of the Victorian era, such as the telegraph, the printing press, the railroad, steamships, and major constructions like the Suez Canal, made it possible to overcome the difficulties associated with the distances separating the different parts of the empire. But as we have seen, each colony, whether a dominion or not, had a particular status and a greater or lesser degree of autonomy, and this made the empire increasingly difficult to administer. To improve matters, at the beginning of the 20th century, the British government developed a more coherent colonial policy, notably through imperial conferences such as that of 1907, which recognized other colonies such as Australia and New Zealand as dominions. But 2 world wars brought this transformation to a halt. In both the First and Second World Wars, the colonies were called upon to help, sending thousands of soldiers to fight in Europe. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the British Empire was weakened and its authority over its colonies disappeared. After 1945, it was time for independence. In the second half of the 20th century, the British Empire suffered a long decline, during which its colonies gradually gained independence, starting with India in 1947 and ending with the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. But today, the British Empire has not totally disappeared. What remains of it is united in an international organization, the Commonwealth. It comprises 56 states and 2.4 billion inhabitants, almost all former colonies such as Canada, India, and South Africa. Its head remains the current sovereign of the United Kingdom. Although Great Britain no longer has control over its members, the Commonwealth is above all a forum for discussion between independent states united by a shared history and culture. This does not, however, erase the painful memory of colonization, as demonstrated by some of the anti-UK reactions to the death of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2021. That's the end of today's topic. Thank you for your attention. I hope you didn't forget to like the video if you liked the content and subscribe to the channel.